Howdy, everyone. All right, so I did not film it, obviously, otherwise, you would have already seen it. But what I had done next was the front canopy. I had it in place, I had all my alignment marks lined up. I had the back edge of the canopy lined up as best as I can get it with my reference line here. I just made sure that the canopy was exactly where I wanted it to be, and it was sitting where it wanted to be in relation to the frame and the fuselage. So at that point, what you do is the canopy comes back across over the roll bar. When the canopy is in the correct position, you lightly clamp it to the roll bar along the top. And then you reach underneath and you push up on the frame here to make sure that the frame is touching the inside underneath of the canopy. So again, the canopy is being held in place along this back edge with clamps in this orientation to hold it. Then you push up from underneath the actual canopy frame, you push it up so that it is sitting tight, or at least touching the canopy from underneath. Of course, I've taken my clamps off temporarily, but you want to make sure that the frame itself is clamped down onto your spacer. You want that clamped down in position on both sides. You want this clamped down into position on your spacer. So this is in the right location. And then you push up on this here so that this will touch the canopy frame. You do that on both sides. Once you have it pushed up, let me go back from the rear here. Once you reach underneath and you push this up against the canopy, then you reach underneath with a clamp and clamp this back to the roll bar. So again, canopy is clamped to the roll bar back here, flush to the roll bar, reach underneath, push the canopy frame up against the canopy itself, and then with a clamp the frame to the roll bar in this orientation here. That will ensure that when the canopy is laying on the roll bar, that the canopy frame is touching the canopy itself. Once you have the frame clamped to the roll bar, then carefully take the clamps off that are holding the canopy down, and then take the canopy off. Now this is still clamped into position to the roll bar, and then at that point you carefully match drill the other holes on the splice plate. Now I've already done that. I've already put the plate back on the other side of the roll bar for now, but that's how you handle that operation. So I've done that. I took the clamps off that I was talking about in the corners because I needed to raise this up so I can deburr the holes before putting the plate back on the back side. That's why my clamps are gone. So I believe next is to refit the canopy, reposition it, make sure it's everything that you want it to be, and start laying out the hole pattern. I believe that's next. Not there yet. So I'm going to get the canopy back on. I'm going to see how it fits without clamping these corners, and take on whatever comes next. Oh, another thing I want to talk about. Before I start drilling any holes in the canopy, before I start drilling any holes in the frame, before I start drilling any holes through this side rail, I'm going to install the pneumatic actuators. If you remember earlier in the build, I had added in these corners inside, I had added a couple of nut plates to the frame and bolts. And those bolts, when the canopy is closed, they come in contact with this, whatever bulkhead this is in here. I had heard about people when they put their actuators on the canopy frame, that force pushes the frame forward. Is that correct? No, it pushes it back, which was going to affect, is that right? Now I'm confused. No, it pushes it forward. When it's closed, it pushes it forward. So it's another reason why I haven't come back and fooled with this gap yet. So I'm going to install the actuators on both sides, and then I'm going to adjust those bolts to make sure that this frame hasn't come forward. I'm going to make sure that these spacers in here are clamped to hold it in place with the actuators in place, and then I'm going to run those bolts out until they touch the framing that's in here. That will prevent this forward part of the frame from inching up closer to this more than it should. Don't know if that's a real concern or not, but I have heard people, once they've installed their actuators, that it makes things shift. So I don't want to necessarily put a bunch of holes and a bunch of framing and in the canopy, and then later on put in the actuators and somehow have them create a problem. So I'm going to put those on first, run my bolts to where I need to run them so that the canopy frame is positioned correctly, and then I'll have my canopy back in place and aligned, and then I'll worry about doing the holes at that point. So that's just the order that I'm going to do things. I know, like I said, I basically haven't looked at the van's plans much. I haven't read the written instructions that much. I'm kind of doing my own thing at the moment, but I do reference them from time to time just to make sure I'm not getting too far ahead of myself. So splice plate done. Next up, actuators. Make sure the frame hasn't moved or done anything weird with the actuators in place, and then start fitting the canopy and finding out how to drill all these holes. All right, talk to you guys later. Howdy everyone. So I'm working on attaching the lift struts to the canopy frame like I talked about before. Before I get too far along with fitting the plexiglass and actually drilling holes, I wanted to get these lift struts installed first. So I've been working on these little brackets. These are drawn up in the plans, and I pretty much followed the plans except for a couple of minor things. This spacer that you see here on the plans, this is actually made up of two individual pieces. Each piece is 1/8 inch thick, and you sandwich them together to make up the spacer. And I decided just to go ahead and go right to a solid 1/4 inch instead of two 1/8 inch plates. The other thing that I decided to do, the plans show the two individual plates for the spacer and then the plate for the actual attach bracket. They get bolted through the frame and are held together with nuts, and all those pieces are loose. So I decided to add a couple of extra holes and rivet my pieces together. So instead of having 3 individual pieces held together with the 2 mounting bolts, I went ahead and made mine 2 pieces, and I have them held together with rivets. And then of course this whole assembly will get bolted to the airframe. I've got one done and actually installed. Pretty straightforward stuff. That's it right there. There are a couple of measurements you have to pay attention to. The measurement between centers of the mounting points, so between this pivot and this pivot over here, the center distance between those 2 points cannot be any closer than a set amount. I think it's 9 and 9/16 or 9 7/16, something like that. It's in the prints. If you put those closer together than that, the strut itself will bind and you won't be able to get your canopy closed all the way. So that's a critical distance. And if you go too far out, then your canopy won't open as far. So there's a fine line there between getting the maximum amount that the canopy will swing open and making sure that you're not so tight on this distance that your struts bind. So, and the other critical measurement is the spacing of this piece, the pivot ball here, the center line of the pivot ball off of the face of your plate here. That height here has to be, it can't be too close. Wow, I can't think straight. There's a dimension for that height. If you're too low, then the strut is going to interfere with this plate. So you just want to make sure that this is up high enough that the strut can rotate freely. But you don't want to get it so high. If you have it up too high here, then you won't be able to get the nuts on these screws, because the nuts will be interfering with the same plate, but from underneath. Up inside here, you won't be able to get the nuts onto these screws. So that height adjustment is relatively critical. And then, like I said, the center to center distance between the two mounting points here and here, that distance is also critical. So got one done and in. I'm going to put the other one in here shortly. And then before I actually attach the struts to these, I want to make sure that this canopy can open all the way without binding. And I started to work on that a little bit, just very gradually sanding the front edge of the canopy frame, sanding that back so there'll be enough clearance for this to open without getting hung up on the forward skin. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the gist of it is, like I said, just filing that back to open up the gap, and it looks like I'm going to have a pretty good sized gap. So all of the effort that I put into having minimal gap when I made this frame wasn't really too important. I knew that I was going to have to file that back, so I wanted to keep the gap as close as possible, because I assumed that as I continued to work through installing more and more components and fine-tuning everything as I went, that gap may potentially open up more and more and more. And by the time I got everything done, I wouldn't have to file anything. But I guess it is good news that nothing really shifted as much as I thought it would, if at all. And now I have to go back and open up the gap. But it's going to be a pretty good sized gap, unfortunately, but that's just how it is. I don't know if all canopy skins are like that. I know Vans wants you to maintain something ridiculous like a 32nd of an inch gap. I don't know how that's possible, because I've got a solid 1/16 of an inch gap right now, and it's still too tight. So there you have it. Let me get these, I'm going to get this other anchor point installed, and then I'm going to go back to getting this skin cleaned up so I can get the canopy to swing open all the way freely. Once I'm confident it can do that without tearing the skin up, then I'll hook up those struts and see how they fit. Oh, another thing that's critical, I talked about the distance between the two centers. Whatever distance you come up with, you want to maintain that exact distance on both sides. All right? Because when the canopy is open, you want both struts to extend the same amount. And when the canopy is closed, you want them compressed the same. You don't want, if you've got one side really tight, when you open up the canopy, this side is going to extend all the way and stop, and that strut is still going to be slightly compressed, and that's going to put a side load on your canopy. And I don't know when you go to close it if that's going to cause an issue with it being off center. So you don't want that. You want both struts to be the same length, so that when your canopy opens and closes, they both fully extend and fully compress equally, so you're not putting any kind of weird side loads on the frame itself. So all right, I'll get to busting on some stuff, and I'll talk to you later.